data science, particularly, I think, things like LLMs, we touched on this a little bit, will, I think, be able to accelerate discoveries in a lot of different fields,
Mhm.
including neuroscience. I mean, do you agree? Do you think that there are emerging data science technologies or methodologies that could accelerate our understanding of the brain in the coming 10 years?
Yeah, oh, for sure. I mean, it's almost a given that it has to and will, right? It's like saying, do you think calculators will, accelerate science? Yes. Do you think search engines are going to? I can't even imagine running a research lab without search engines, right? Just the rate at which I can quickly and easily discover information has just a huge impact on the way that everybody does science, right? So Google is probably one of those transformative aspects of science in the last 100 years, right? It's significantly shaped the way that we are able to find and retrieve information that allows us to then continue to build science and do research better, more accurately, and faster. And so I think LLMs are going to be something similar, right? Yes, there are so many problems with the current iteration of LLMs, hallucinating and things like this, right? Um, but they do, you can see the glimmer of where the future will be. Right? And so, just to give a concrete example, when I was doing my PhD, I was looking specifically at the effect that very focal brain lesions in the prefrontal cortex or the basal ganglia, two interconnected structures in the brain that are known to be involved in higher level cognition. If somebody has a stroke that damages one of these brain regions, what impact does that have on their memory functions? That's what I spent my PhD doing. At the start of my PhD 20 years ago, in 2004, in my naivete, I believed that there must be some kind of website that I could go to where I could click on the prefrontal cortex on the brain, like an image of a brain, and get a listing of what all the inputs and outputs to that brain region are. That didn't exist, and it still doesn't exist. Just very frustrating. And that drove me to ultimately leading to a project years later, at the end of my PhD, that my wife and I had published together, which was this issue frustrated me and stuck with me for so long because instead of having like a really easily to discover like mapping of these inputs and outputs to these different brain regions, I had to go into the UC Berkeley where I did my PhD, like archives of peer-reviewed papers published in the 1970s, where they did all these anatomical tracing studies and digging through these old papers to try and figure out what the inputs and outputs were to these brain regions. And I was at a conference on a panel at Stanford in 2010 or so, with quite a number of actually like names that your listeners will probably be familiar with, senior, eminent people in AI and neuroscience. And somebody asked a question on the panel, and I answered by saying, the peer-reviewed neuroscience literature probably knows the brain. Like, there's something like 3 million peer-reviewed neuroscience papers that have been published that are indexed in PubMed, which is the National Library of Medicine, NIH database of peer-reviewed biomedical research. If we could tap into all of that knowledge, we probably would be 50% farther along in neuroscience, but we as humans are limited to how much we can read and synthesize. And one of the faculty members that is a sort of giant in the field basically said that's really dumb, and I was like, I'm pretty sure I'm right about this. And so back in 2010, my wife and I did like a proto NLP project, where I just did, I should say she wrote the Python code to scrape all of the sort of text out of the abstracts of all of these papers to just look at like co-occurrences of words and phrases, with the hypothesis being that the more frequently two ideas were discussed in the peer-reviewed literature, the more likely they are to be related. So, very simplistically, if a paper is written about Alzheimer's disease, they tend to also talk about memory because Alzheimer's disease has a significant impact on memory. But it also mentioned like tauopathies, which is one of the mechanisms by which we think Alzheimer's disease it manifests. But papers that talk about Alzheimer's disease are less likely to talk about bradykinesia, which is like slow moving, which is much more commonly observed in Parkinson's disease, right? And so by looking at the sort of word frequencies and co-occurrences, very simplistic NLP, proto NLP, we built a graph of like a knowledge graph of neuroscience. And so this was a paper that we published in 2012. We did the project in 2009, 2010, and it was a pain in the ass to publish because all the peer reviewers, we built this knowledge graph, and then we could find clusters in the graph. And we went to publish this paper, and we're like, hey, look, we can naturally, from natural language free-form peer-reviewed text, discover clusters of topics that are interrelated. Like Parkinson's disease is highly clustered with dopamine, the neurotransmitter, and neurons in the substantia nigra, which are the dopaminergic neurons that die off in Parkinson's disease that give rise to motor tremors and bradykinesia. And this is like naturally discovered just through text co-occurrences. And the peer reviewers said something like, yeah, we know these things. And it was like, yeah, I know you as an expert who's read the principles of neuroscience and has been studying neuroscience for 20 years knows, but now math knows. Isn't that amazing? And back in 2010, people weren't really buying it. And now I think we're in an era where we can do that same thing. In my lab, we're trying to build this right now, actually. That same thing, but like 2 orders of magnitude more sophisticated, right? So we actually are building that site right now where you can go click on the prefrontal cortex and or whatever brain region, and it is built on everything we know from publicly available data sets of human brain imaging about the brain. So the Allen Brain Institute has a database of gene expression in the human brain. There's about 20,000 or so different genes that are differentially expressed across the human brain. So we pull that data set in. And then there's another data set of like neurotransmitter densities based on positron emission tomography, and pull that data set in and pull this data set in. And this has already been done by collaborators up at McGill University. Bratislav Mizik is the lab head there. And they created an open source Python package called Neuromaps, where I think it's Ross Markello and Justine Hansen are the first authors on the Neuromaps paper published a couple of years ago, where they did all the legwork of like actually going out and pulling in all these publicly available data sets. And so what we're doing right now in the lab is we're building a brain viewer that collates all these different data sets in browser. So you can click on an arbitrary brain region and get a listing of everything we know about this part of the brain. And the next step that we're trying to build on top of that with an industry collaborator who cannot be named yet because it's not formalized. But alongside that browser is an LLM chat window where you can then say, show me the hippocampus. And then the LLM will pop up, then like illustrate on the screen in this sort of dynamic brain viewer where the hippocampus is. And then you can say, give me a listing of the top 10 genes that are most strongly expressed in the hippocampus, uniquely compared to other brain regions. And then you can ask, what are the primary inputs and outputs? And it'll show the primary inputs and outputs, right? And so we're trying to build a like brain discovery engine that is LLM powered, that is trained on these peer-reviewed papers and these open data sets, so that you can do better neuroscience discovery, so that we're sort of dissolving the boundaries between, like I said at the beginning of the podcast, the neurogeneticists who don't know anything about theoretical neuroscience, who don't know anything about neuroanatomy, right? And trying to sort of dissolve all those boundaries to bring all these different data sets together in one easy to digest platform. So, that's honestly still probably a couple of years away, but we're prototyping it right now.